Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, I'm Rachel and I'm an Egyptology PhD candidate, and this video is going to be all about the area that's actually my specialism. It's going to be about the ancient Egyptian language. So if you're interested in a bit of an introduction to the Egyptian language, please keep watching. So the first thing that I think is really important to point out about ancient Egyptian is it is actually a proper language in the sense of languages that we speak today. So people might look at hieroglyphs and see a bird symbol or a fish symbol and think, okay, that is literally just representing a bird or a fish. But most of the time this isn't the case. So these symbols would have their own phonetic value. They'd represent the sounds that were used in the spoken language and that were spoken by ancient Egyptian people. And the ancient Egyptian language also had an equally complex grammar system to many of the modern languages that we use today. So ancient Egyptian does actually have a little bit more in common with our modern languages than you might actually think. And this is even the case with some of the vocabulary. So actually the word in English, ebony, the type of wood, it actually comes from the Egyptian word hebeni, which has been passed down and still survives today, and we still use it today. But then actually the earliest examples of ancient Egyptian writing are a little bit different from this because, well, like many early examples of writing, the pictographic signs actually do just represent the things that they depict. So for example, in the earliest hieroglyphs, a hieroglyph of, say, a bull does actually just represent a bull. The earliest examples of ancient Egyptian writing come from tomb U-j in Abydos, and this dates from around 3400 to 3200 BCE. There would have been a spoken language in use before this, which itself would have actually had its full grammar system, even though this wasn't represented in the earliest writing systems. But obviously there's no recorded version of the spoken language, so we have no idea what it sounded like, we have no idea how long it was in use for as Egyptian, we have no idea whether it developed from maybe a proto-language. Obviously we can guess at these things, but nobody really knows for sure. But these are a whole other issue. But what we do have evidence for from ancient Egyptian is the written language. So that's where a lot of our knowledge about the ancient Egyptian language comes from. The earliest examples of Egyptian writing were labels, which were attached to items that would then be placed in somebody's tomb. And as I said, these earliest examples of writing needs direct representation. So the picture that was drawn actually did represent literally what it showed. But it's also been hypothesized that some of these represented administrative districts or towns, which may be showing where the goods that the label is attached to has come from. As the writing system developed, the hieroglyphic symbols that we use began to be associated with phonetic values. So they began to represent the sound of the word as it was spoken, as well as just its meaning. This meant that the written forms of more abstract words, which didn't necessarily represent a physical object, could then be developed. And these tended to develop following the REBUS principle, which basically involved the sound being associated with one word being taken and used to form the written form of another word. So for example, we have a hieroglyph which is a depiction of a human face, which was literally used to write the word for face. But this word sounded something like hair. It had used two consonants, which is an H and an R. And this was then subsequently used to form the written form of other words which had a similar sound. So it was also used to form the word hair, meaning upon, and it could be used to form part of the word harit, which means terror, and there's loads of other examples. But each of these words then used the hieroglyph of a face, but in each of the new words it no longer directly represented the meaning of face. So in this way, as it developed, the ancient Egyptian written language was able to form more and more words, and it also developed the ability to form more complex grammar. So you essentially ended up with a written system that could be used to write down anything that you could say in the spoken language. So this all happened by about 2600 BCE, And then after this, we tend to split the Egyptian language into 5 stages. So we have Old Egyptian from about 2600 to 2000 BCE, Middle Egyptian from 2000 to about 1350 BCE, Late Egyptian from 1350 to 700 BCE, Demotic from about 700 BCE to 200 CE, and then Coptic from about 300 CE onwards. And obviously there's a little bit of a gap between Demotic and Coptic there, but I will go back to that in a second. So this categorization of these language stages obviously wasn't done by ancient Egyptian language users themselves, although they would have been aware of a sort of difference between the grammars and vocabulary of each stage. But it's actually been categorized by Egyptologists over the last sort of couple of hundred years. And the differences in stages are generally used to represent when there's a particular different grammar or a different script in use. But when the actual language was in use, these changes would have happened very gradually. So there's a lot of overlap between different stages in terms of grammar, vocabulary, that sort of thing. Across these language stages, there are also various different scripts in use. So the most well-known of these is hieroglyphs, and this was used to write Old Egyptian, Middle Egyptian, and Late Egyptian. The hieroglyphic script was the first writing system developed in Egypt, but later on in the language it was mainly used to write sort of more formal texts and stone inscriptions, maybe in temples or tombs, because it was kind of more time consuming to write, so it wasn't necessarily used as much for everyday texts such as maybe letters or administrative texts. And this is actually kind of reflected in the name of the script. So our word hieroglyph or hieroglyphic comes from the Greek name for this script, which is Hieroglyphica Grammata, which means something like sacred inscribed writing. So it's kind of reflecting that it was inscribed in stones. And in Egyptian itself, this script was referred to as Medu Neche, which means something like God's words or divine words. Hieroglyphs were actually in use for a really long time, so from the earliest texts that I mentioned before, from about 3400 to 3200 BCE, to the last known inscription, which is from Philae, which is dated to 394 CE. There's also a more cursive form of hieroglyphs, which we imaginatively call cursive hieroglyphs, and these were used more on materials such as papyrus or wood. Cursive hieroglyphs are most commonly found from the Ramesside period, which is from about 1295 to 1069 BCE, and they were used to write mainly religious texts, so for example the Book of the Dead. As well as hieroglyphs, there's also a much more cursive script called hieratic, and this name comes from the Greek hieratica grammata, which means priestly writing, and this was also used alongside hieroglyphs to write Old, Middle and Late Egyptian. Hieratic originated as a more cursive form of hieroglyphs, and many hieratic signs actually show a resemblance to the hieroglyphs they originated from. Hieratic was used for a lot of Egyptian texts that were written on papyrus, including administrative texts or literary narrative tales, but it wasn't really used in more formal texts or like religious texts. So it was kind of used as an informal complement to the more formal script of hieroglyphs. And these two scripts were used alongside each other for well over 2,000 years. Then from the 7th century BCE, we find the use of another script, which is Demotic. And this name again comes from a Greek name, which is Demotica Grammata, means something like popular writing. And Demotic was even more cursive than hieratic, and most of its signs don't really look like their kind of equivalent hieroglyphs. And this kind of cursive, really cursive nature means that as kind of a modern reader of ancient Egyptian, it does make Demotic the worst script to learn. It's the most difficult, for sure. As you can probably work out, the Demotic script was used for the Demotic language stage. So we have this name Demotic as the name of the language and the script at this time. Initially, Demotic was used for more administrative texts or legal texts, and hieroglyphs and hieratic continue to be used for literary texts or religious texts and things like that. At this time though, the actual language that was being written in hieroglyphs was a form of Middle Egyptian, but kind of like an archaic form as it was perceived by later Egyptian speakers. So it would be kind of like if an English speaker today tried to write in the same style as Shakespeare, perhaps. But then after a couple of hundred years, the use of demotic to write religious and literary texts did then become more widespread. And then from the invasion of Egypt by Alexander in 332 BCE, Greek actually became the main language that was used by the rulers of Egypt, and it spread to become the main administrative language throughout the country. During this time, the use of demotic did slowly die out, but then by slowly I do mean over the course of about 500 years, so it's all very relative. And by around the 2nd century CE, the use of native Egyptian scripts to produce written documents has significantly decreased, although obviously the spoken language would have remained in use for native Egyptian speakers. But this is essentially why we get the gap between demotic and Coptic that I pointed out earlier, since we don't really have much evidence of either of these scripts from this stage, and the majority of written documents are in Greek. But within the early 1st millennium CE, the Coptic script started to emerge. And like demotic, we have the same name for the language stage and script here. So the Coptic script was used to write the Coptic stage of the Egyptian language. The Coptic script originated in Egyptian priestly communities and was designed as a means of writing the native Egyptian spoken language using the Greek alphabet, with Greek being the main written language at this time. And it also used a few signs from demotic to represent some of the sounds that were used in Egyptian but weren't really represented in Greek. The Coptic writing system became standardized around the 3rd to 4th centuries CE, and we get a lot more texts from it during this time, which is why we generally kind of class the Coptic language stage as starting from around the 3rd century. A lot of the texts that we have written in Coptic are translations of religious texts from Greek. So there's quite a few biblical texts or texts about the lives of religious figures. But then we also get original compositions in Coptic, again mainly religious texts, such as the works attributed to Shenute, who was one of the abbots at the White Monastery in Egypt. We don't really get that many administrative documents in Coptic because Greek did continue to be used as the main administrative language throughout this time. And Coptic's quite interesting because it's the main language stage where we can actually see different dialects in the Egyptian language. This is something that's mostly quite hard to see from the written language, especially because all the scripts before Coptic didn't actually write vowels. Everything that was represented was just the sounds of consonants. But then we do get vowels written in Coptic, and this helps us to see the different spellings and different kind of pronunciations of words that were used in different areas in Egypt. But the use of Coptic to create new texts, or even to copy Greek texts really, began to reduce after the invasion of Egypt by the Rashidun Caliphate in the 7th century CE, after which Arabic became increasingly used as the main language in Egypt. However, the Coptic script does actually still survive today as the liturgical language of the Coptic Church in Egypt. So technically the ancient Egyptian language is still in use, although as it's not actually the native language of any community, it still counts as a dead language. So that's pretty much your introduction to the ancient Egyptian language, mostly about the writing system, since the written language is obviously all that survives, and it's pretty much all we have to go on for everything that we really know about the Egyptian language. But yeah, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys in my next video.